Hi, it's me. Number 10. Plato's description. The only surviving account of Atlantis comes from the ancient Greek philosopher Plato, who first described it in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, which are named after two Athenian statesmen. In them, Plato uses the story of Atlantis to contrast the great naval power with the cultural and political glories of his own city. He describes the island as being larger than either ancient Libya or Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. It would have been visible to the Greeks from their mainland, and Plato says that anyone who has sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, would be able to see it. But just what did Atlantis look like? And how big exactly was it? Well, according to Plato, the island was circular in shape and had a perfectly round harbor in the center. From there, a canal extended outwards to the open ocean. But before we go any further, if you haven't already done so, why didn't you give this video a thumbs up to help us reach more history lovers like yourself? Thanks for your support. According to Plato's text, Atlantis was surrounded by a wall that divided it into concentric rings or zones of land and water. Each zone was separated by a canal and contained a different type of building dedicated to one of the island's gods. Around the outer edge of the island was a wide avenue lined with olive trees. Beyond this, however, lay the open countryside where cattle and other livestock grazed. In the center of the island was a massive temple dedicated to Poseidon, who was the supreme ruler of Atlantis. In his dialogue, Plato tells the story of how the sea god Poseidon loved a mortal woman named Cleito, and they had 10 sons together. When Cleito died, Poseidon decided to establish a kingdom on an island in her honor. Every 5th year, he summoned all of his sons to the island, and the ones who participated in religious ceremonies were given control of one of the concentric circles that made up the island. As a result, each of the 10 kingdoms had access to the resources of the entire island, and so everyone prospered. Plato believed that the Atlanteans were blessed by the gods because of their piety, which made them extremely powerful. They used their strength to conquer many lands, including parts of Europe and Libya. However, after 9 generations of hereditary kings, the Atlanteans became corrupt and began to fight amongst themselves. In addition, they started to make unreasonable demands of the other nations around them. When the gods saw how greedy and overambitious the Atlanteans had become, they sent a series of earthquakes and floods to punish them. It says that in a single day and night, Atlantis was destroyed and swallowed by the Atlantic Ocean. The suddenness of its disappearance shows how little time the people of Atlantis had to escape. 9. A moral allegory. Scholars have debated whether Plato intended the story of Atlantis to be taken literally or if it was a myth to convey a deeper meaning. Most scholars believe that Plato's description of Atlantis was a moral allegory meant to highlight the superiority of his ideal state, Athens, and warn about what could happen if an otherwise good state became too ambitious. For example, Plato repeatedly emphasizes that the Atlanteans became corrupt and disobedient to the gods, which led to their destruction. This suggests that the main purpose of the story is to teach a lesson rather than recount actual historical events. This is supported by the fact that Plato uses the story of Atlantis to contrast the wisdom of the philosopher kings who ruled Athens during his lifetime. The story also contains numerous parallels to the Trojan War, which occurred about 200 years before Plato's lifetime. Like the Trojans, the Atlanteans were arrogant and overreached themselves, leading to divine punishment. Plato may have been using the Trojan War as a source for his story of Atlantis. Another piece of evidence for this theory is the fact that Plato wrote his story of Atlantis during a time when Athens was at war with Sparta. During this time, Athens had recently lost a major battle, and Plato may have been using the story of Atlantis to express his view that Athens was once a great power, but had since fallen from grace. Number 8. The Atlantic Ocean. Some people have interpreted the location of Atlantis to mean that it was somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. This belief is based on the fact that Plato mentioned that the island was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is now known as the Strait of Gibraltar. Supporters of this theory argue that Plato was referring to a strait west of the Strait of Gibraltar, such as the Florida Straits, which separate Florida from Cuba and the Bahamas. Others suggest that the strait could have been between Great Britain and Ireland, or the Faroe Islands in Iceland. Proponents of these theories point out that Plato's descriptions of Atlantis match well with these locations, and that archaeological evidence has shown that ancient Greeks may have sailed as far west as North America. However, mainstream scholars reject the idea that Plato was referring to a strait in the Atlantic Ocean. They argue that the Pillars of Hercules is a well-known ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, and that Plato would not have used it to refer to another strait. Additionally, no archaeological evidence has been found to support the idea that the ancient Greeks sailed to the Americas. Number 7. The Mediterranean Sea. Many scholars believe that Atlantis actually existed in the Mediterranean Sea, perhaps near the Egyptian coast or off the coast of Greece. Supporters of this theory argue that Plato was referring to a real place when he described Atlantis, and that the island was destroyed by natural disaster. They point out that the Mediterranean Sea was home to several powerful naval empires, such as the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians, and that Plato may have been drawing inspiration from one of these cultures when he created Atlantis. However, there is no archaeological evidence to support the idea that Atlantis existed in the Mediterranean Sea. Additionally, Plato's description of Atlantis as being larger than Libya and Asia Minor does not fit with any known islands in the Mediterranean. No. 6. Antarctica. One of the most outlandish theories about the location of Atlantis is that it was located in Antarctica. This theory is based on the belief that Antarctica was once a habitable landmass, and that it was home to an advanced civilization. Supporters of this theory argue that the ancient Greeks may have sailed to Antarctica, and that Plato was referring to the continent when he described Atlantis. They point out that Antarctica was once covered in ice, and that this may explain why no archaeological evidence has been found to support the idea that Atlantis existed there. However, mainstream scholars reject the idea that Atlantis was located in Antarctica. They argue that there is no evidence that the ancient Greeks sailed to Antarctica, and that Plato would not have been able to describe the island in such detail if it had been located there. Number 5. Santorini. One popular theory is that Plato based the story of Atlantis on the volcanic eruption on the Greek island of Thera, which is now known as Santorini. The eruption occurred around 1500 BC and it devastated the nearby Minoan civilization. Supporters of this theory argue that the Minoans were known for their advanced naval technology and that Plato may have been referring to them when he described the Atlanteans. They also point out that the Minoan civilization collapsed after the eruption, and that this could have inspired the idea of Atlantis being destroyed by natural disaster. However, mainstream scholars reject the idea that Plato was referring to Santorini. They argue that the Minoan civilization was not known for being corrupt and overambitious, which is a key part of Plato's story. 4. The Nile Delta. Another theory is that Atlantis was located in the Nile Delta in Egypt. Supporters of this theory argue that the Nile Delta was home to several powerful kingdoms, and that Plato may have been referring to one of these cultures when he described Atlantis. They also point out that the Egyptians were known for their advanced engineering, and that Plato's description of Atlantis having concentric rings of land and water could have been based on the Nile Delta's network of canals. However, mainstream scholars reject the idea that Atlantis was located in the Nile Delta. They argue that there is no evidence that Plato visited Egypt, and that he would not have been able to describe the island in such detail if it had been located there. No. 3. The Black Sea. One intriguing theory is that Atlantis was located in the Black Sea near the Crimean Peninsula. This theory is based on the belief that the Black Sea was once connected to the Atlantic Ocean, and that it was home to a powerful civilization. Supporters of this theory argue that the ancient Greeks may have sailed to the Black Sea and that Plato was referring to the sea when he described Atlantis. They also point out that the Black Sea was once rich in fish and other marine life, and that this could have inspired the idea of Atlantis being a prosperous naval empire. However, mainstream scholars reject the idea that Atlantis was located in the Black Sea. They argue that there is no evidence that the ancient Greeks sailed to the Black Sea and that Plato would not have been able to describe the island in such detail if it had been located there. 2. The Baltic Sea. Another theory is that Atlantis was located in the Baltic Sea between Sweden and Denmark. This theory is based on the belief that the Baltic Sea was once home to a powerful civilization that was destroyed by natural disaster. Supporters of this theory argue that the ancient Greeks may have sailed to the Baltic Sea and that Plato was referring to the sea when he described Atlantis. They also point out that the Baltic Sea was once covered in ice, and that this could explain why no archaeological evidence has been found to support the idea that Atlantis existed there. However, mainstream scholars reject the idea that Atlantis was located in the Baltic Sea. They argue that there is no evidence that the ancient Greeks sailed to the Baltic Sea and that Plato would not have been able to describe the island in such detail if it had been located there. Number 1. No real-world location. Despite the many theories about the location of Atlantis, it is possible that Plato never intended the island to be taken literally. As we mentioned earlier, Plato was known for using stories and myths to convey philosophical ideas, and the story of Atlantis could have been one of them. In fact, some scholars believe that Atlantis was simply a figment of Plato's imagination, and that he created the story as an exercise in writing. If this is true, then there is no real-world location for Atlantis, and the entire story is nothing more than a philosophical allegory. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already and check out our other videos, which are designed to bring history to life. Today, we were going to talk about the geography of Atlantis based on what Plato has told us in his work. What kind of place was Atlantis? Let's find out. The cradle of Western civilization, the Mediterranean Sea, is the world's favorite vacation spot. If you don't believe me, just check out how many cruises are going on there right now. However, this beautiful blue expanse of water hides great danger for sailors. It's not the pirates, though. Those are only in the movies. It's the waves, winds and currents of the Mediterranean that are often so unpredictable and change so quickly that even today it is considered one of the most difficult seas to navigate. In the ancient world, ships were much more vulnerable to the whims of the sea and storms could easily sink them. And if your ship sank, chances were you would die along with it unless you managed to swim to some piece of land. So when the Greeks wanted to describe someone as unhappy or unlucky, they said that Poseidon dragged him down to his watery grave. Now, imagine being in a boat on the open ocean, and you see a dark shadow rising up out of the water. It looked like a huge wave, but as you get closer, you realize that it's actually an island. As you sail closer, you can hear the sounds of hammering and shouting, people talking, animals bleating and flutes playing music. You think to yourself, what bad luck brought me here? But then the sight that meets your eyes makes you forget about all your troubles because before you stand a marvelous city, bigger and more beautiful than anything you've ever seen. Its walls are adorned with all kinds of precious stones and its streets are packed with people from all over the world. How could such a magnificent place be hiding in the middle of the sea? And what kind of disaster befell it? We will talk about it in this episode of Lost Civilizations. Atlantis. The name comes from a Greek word meaning hidden island. For the first time, Atlantis appears in the historical record in the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato, who wrote about it in the 360s BC in his dialogues. In the Critias, Plato tells the story of a military expedition of the Athenians against the island of Atlantis, which happened 9,000 years before his time. But according to Plato, 1,000 years before the war, the island disappeared under the sea. What specific details does Plato give about Atlantis's geography and layout? Let's examine what he says in his dialogue Critias. According to Plato, Atlantis was an island larger than ancient Libya and Asia Minor combined. The northern part and the shores of the island were mostly mountainous. In the southern part of the island, there was a large, fertile plain. He described it as oblong in shape, extending about 3,000 stadia in one direction and 2,000 stadia across inland. The plain was level and surrounded by mountains that descended towards the sea. Imagine a rectangular area, like a piece of land, slightly longer than it was wide. This area was completely flat and was surrounded by mountains on all sides. These mountains stretched from the corners of the rectangle to the edges, where they met the sea. Plato goes on to say that close to the coast, about 50 stadia from the sea, there was a low mountain with a central hill that was the site of the capital city. Around the base of this central hill were streams of water flowing from the mountains, forming rings of marshland, and then from there, the city extended outward in concentric circles. Let's stop for a second. If Atlantis really did exist, where could it have been located? Plato himself connects the existence of the island with the existence of the Atlantic Ocean. Thus, it is obvious that the location of Atlantis cannot be in the inland sea of the same name in Spain. Moreover, he writes that the island was visible from the shores of Libya. This fact eliminates the Azores, Madeira and the Canary Islands, as well as the Cape Verde archipelago, which are too far west. Another argument against these islands is that there's no mention of volcanic activity on Atlantis, although the Azores, Madeira and the Canary Islands are of volcanic origin, and Plato writes that the island was of volcanic origin. In addition, other Greek authors mention the existence of Atlantis, and they also placed it somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. For example, the historian Posidonius, who traveled to the Atlantic coast of Africa, believed that Atlantis was located between the Strait of Gibraltar and the Canary Islands. The Roman philosopher Pliny the Elder believed that Atlantis was located somewhere near the British Isles. Finally, the exact location of Atlantis is still unknown and is the subject of debate among researchers. Perhaps it never existed at all. But let's move on. Surrounding the capital city was a wall made of stone, and outside the city walls was a circular mountain that formed a central island. Similar to the rings of the onion, only 5 stadia in diameter. Within the first ring, next to the outer wall, there were 2 trenches or canals dug around the city. One was 300 feet wide, 100 feet deep and 50 stadia long, connecting the outermost ring with the sea and allowing naval access. Around the base of this circular mountain, which served as the center of the island, were 2 more canals, one freshwater and one saltwater, used for drinking and other domestic purposes. There was a rotor on the central mountain, and in the center itself, a temple to Poseidon, decorated with gold and precious stones. The freshwater canal started from a sacred marsh and ended at the center of the island. The circular mountain in the middle of the city was sacred, and no one was allowed to enter it. But on the top of this hill, Plato writes, stood a temple of the god Poseidon, adorned with gold and adornments of all kinds. The entire plain was surrounded by a ditch or canal about 10,000 stadia in length. It starts from the northwest corner of the plain, runs around it entirely, collects water from the surrounding mountains, and then empties into the sea near the city. From here, another canal extends into the sea about 100 stadia and divides into 2 branches, each of which turns toward the east and west, like 2 wings. These branches were also 100 stadia long and thus formed 3 large basins within the sea, separated from each other by an isthmus connecting the island to the mainland. The water in these basins came from the river that flowed from the surrounding mountains and collected there. The strait between the isthmus and the island was navigable and could accommodate a large number of ships. Plato goes on to describe the city as having concentric rings of land and water. Each ring was separated from the other by streets and canals. In the center of the island was a large circular area surrounded by a wall, probably serving as a citadel. The city was divided into 10 concentric circles, each containing its own public buildings and facilities. In the center of the city was a large temple dedicated to Poseidon. Outside the city walls was a wide moat, also serving as a water reservoir for the city's residents. Plato writes that the island was surrounded by a thick forest, and beyond the forest, the land rose into mountains. Thus, Plato describes Atlantis as possessing an advanced engineering layout with concentric rings of water and land, providing both defensive and aesthetic functions. The design also had a well-planned canal system linking the city to the sea, facilitating naval activities. But why did Plato need to come up with such a fantastic place? Plato uses Atlantis as an example of a perfect state. Unfortunately, he doesn't live to finish the story of Atlantis. In the unfinished dialogue Critias, Plato compares the Atlanteans with the Athenians, saying that the former were 9,000 years older than the latter. He also speaks of Atlantis as an advanced and powerful naval power. Later, however, the Atlanteans, with their love of luxury and wealth, forgot about virtue and justice, became lovers of pleasure and lost the favor of the gods. They suffered a terrible punishment when the island disappeared under the sea. It should be noted that Plato's Atlantis is a philosophical allegory, a fictional country embodying certain ideas. However, in the history of science, the theory of Atlantis's existence hasn't died. Until now, scientists put forward various versions of where Atlantis could be located. Was Atlantis real, or is it just a myth? This question has excited the minds of many scientists. Some argue that it really did exist, but it sank into the ocean due to a strong earthquake or wave. Others believe that the Atlanteans simply moved away from the coast and turned the island into a fortress. Still others consider Atlantis to be just a myth that embodies the idea of the ideal state. There's no single answer to this question yet. And perhaps we'll never know for sure if Atlantis really did exist. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about ancient civilizations. See you soon. Bye.